Welcome, everyone, to Agenda 2025. My name is Avik Roy. I'm the president of FREOPP, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. And I'm thrilled to be able to present this panel to you with some outstanding panelists who know a lot about the topic we're going to talk about. Now, before I do that, let me just tell you a little bit about Agenda 2025 and FREOPP. So FREOPP is the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank whose goal is to expand economic opportunity to those who least have it using the tools of free enterprise, individual liberty, technological innovation, and pluralism. And our conference series, which starts today and goes at the same time almost every day for the next 3 weeks, is to really talk about the agenda, not for the next president or the coming Senate in 2021. It's to talk about the agenda we should have in 2025. What are the long-term problems that we have to solve? How do we bring Americans back together again around the principles that when we were growing up, we took for granted as things that all Americans shared? That's what we're really trying to get at with Agenda 2025. What should be the agenda for the president after the one who's being inaugurated on January 20th? And I'm thrilled today to start with this panel about dissecting the 2020 election results and the exit polls and what that means for 2024 and beyond. Obviously, we're still waiting to hear from a number of states, a number of Senate races, but really what we're trying to get at is some of the surprising demographic outcomes here in terms of the way the president has outperformed with Latinos and Black Americans, the way he's maybe a little underperformed with elderly people. What's going on with the Trump coalition? What's going on with the Biden coalition? Will Republicans and Democrats be different in terms of who is in each party as we move forward? And what does this mean for the intellectual movements behind these parties? And for that, we're joined by people. I couldn't pick a better panel than the people we have today. So I'm so thrilled that they all said yes. I'm going to start with Emily Ekins, who's the chief pollster at the Cato Institute, who has done a lot of research on both millennial voting proclivities and also the Trump coalition. We also have Henry Olsen, who's a columnist at the Washington Post and a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, who's also done an enormous amount of research on the Trump voter and is the author of a book called The Working Class Republican, which tackles a lot of these issues and makes the argument that the FDR liberal is basically the Reagan conservative. I'm sure he'll get into that a little bit today. And then we have Ben Domenech, the publisher of The Federalist, which is one of the major leading online publications that covers politics and policy in the country, and Lanhee Chen, who was the policy director for Mitt Romney in 2012 and the domestic policy director in 2008, and is a fellow at the Hoover Institution and a member of our board here at FREOPP. So thanks again to all of you for joining us. And by the way, I should emphasize that if you want to ask questions, we want to make this as interactive as possible right from the get-go. If you have a Twitter account, go to Twitter and tweet at #Agenda2025. And I believe we also have the Zoom chat going as well if you want to put questions in there, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can. Well, let me start, Emily and Henry, with the two of you. What's your takeaway from the exit polls and the polling results you've seen thus far?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are clear. First of all, that the reason, if the president does not win re-election, and as of the announcement within the last hour that there are a couple 100,000 more votes in Arizona than they thought there were, it is now a 50-50 prospect that he will be re-elected. But that if he was not, he is putting together a conservative populist coalition that is hindered primarily by two things from being a majority. The one is his personality, which is driving away college-educated white voters who tend to agree with him on policy, but find him, we'll use the word distasteful, and to a certain extent, senior voters who were worried about his lack of compassion on COVID. But stronger support among Hispanics, stronger support among Blacks, huge support among white working class, despite the polls that had pre-election said Biden was eating into them, and continued strong support among white college voters. This is the prospect for a new Reagan coalition, a new Republican Party that will be different than the past, but could actually be the best way of breaking our national gridlock.
How about you, Emily?
Right. Well, I agree with Henry. And I was looking at the states where Trump has done kind of surprisingly well, places that other Republicans in recent elections haven't done well. And these are states that Reagan, that went for Reagan. And it's for the reasons that I think Henry has, spelled out in his book, and what he was just saying is that it's a different kind of coalition. And I think for a lot of Trump voters, basically what we see is that he gets disproportionate support among those who don't have college degrees, whereas people with college degrees in the suburbs, are going more for Biden. A lot of the kind of the appeal of Trump, I think, isn't just policy based, but it's actually kind of a culture war going on right now. And for that reason, I think that there are a lot of opportunities where people who kind of feel like there are opportunities for kind of free market ideas to take hold in policy might actually have a way forward with this kind of coalition that can acknowledge the cultural concerns that Trump has kind of put on the forefront. And so I think that there's a lot here to unpack. But I think ultimately what Trump is kind of a cultural manifestation. And so this is less about policy and more about that.
Henry, one counter argument is that Biden won the people with an income under 50,000, and Trump won the group with incomes above 50,000, particularly the group with incomes above 100,000. Does that countermand the thesis that Trump is making inroads with working class voters?
No, I don't think it does, because inroads doesn't mean majorities as of yet. It means doing better among certain groups among that group. And also, non-college doesn't mean under $50,000. The median income for a family is over 70. The median income for a household is in the low 60s. So, and many of those people are headed by one or two full-time workers of people without college degrees. So it's something that we see in polls around the world, is that oftentimes the people who are moving into the right are not the poor working class, but they are the hanging on to the middle or at the lower rungs of the middle working class. And what we're seeing, I think, is a move from a highly income stratified Republican Party, where there were larger majorities among the smaller number of people making six figures, to one that is more balanced. And that is the move that it took the British Conservative Party a decade until it finally eliminated its class stratification, and Boris Johnson won his what they call stonking majority last year.
And what about the fact that in the upper Midwest, Biden seems to have regained some of those Democrats that maybe voted for Trump in 2016? Looks like, as far as we can tell at this point, that Biden will outperform Hillary Clinton with that in that region.
He'll outperform her in that region, but it will be largely, although not exclusively, on increased margins in the suburbs. If you take a look at where Biden is going to make up particular ground, it's going to be in the wow counties around Milwaukee, where Trump won by fewer votes, even though it's a heavily Republican area, than he won 4 years ago. Had Trump done, I haven't done the exact numbers, but if Trump had done just as well vote-wise in the wow counties, it would be close to a tie. If you take into account the increased turnout, if he had done as well on the margin, he would have a narrow lead. And that has nothing to do with the white working class. There's a much stronger, coherent maintenance of Trump's support in the working class areas, and Biden's support compared to Clinton tends to be coming from increased margins in the suburbs.
Let me ask you quickly, Emily, and then I'll go to our colleagues on the corners here, at least on my screen. You've written a lot and studied a lot the millennial voters. It seems that the millennial and Gen Z voters went strongly for Biden, as we would expect. Is there anything surprising in the numbers? Did Trump underperform or outperform relative to what you would have expected with those younger groups?
Well, what I noticed was that turnout was a little bit lower among these groups. And, there's a debate in political science about, is voting more about who you love or who you hate? And what I noticed is that among young voters, voting turnout seems to be more about who you love rather than who you hate, because they showed up for Obama. They did not show up nearly as much to vote against Trump. And so that's something that I don't necessarily think holds true for older voters, as we saw that Trump did lose some support among older voters. And I think a lot of that has to do with what Henry said about their feeling that he didn't take COVID seriously enough. And so I think for them, their displeasure with Trump did cause higher turnout. But for younger voters, they seem to be really motivated by charisma. And Biden did not have that, and they just weren't inspired to turn out like they were for Obama.
Ben, tell me about your perspective on this. You're somebody who runs a media organization that really has a particularly strong audience with millennials and Gen Z, particularly female millennials and Gen Zs. What are you seeing that the polls didn't pick up? Or maybe it's consistent with the polls. I don't want to prejudge your answer, but tell me about your thoughts.
Well, I think that one of the big things we've seen is that the assumption, I think, on the part of a lot of DC focused, policy focused people, that these cultural war elements that Emily made mention of were going to be the territory of, conservative intellectuals or people who are writing newspaper columns. That just is not true. And particularly, it's not true for younger generation people who see these dynamics in their day-to-day life, whether it's because they're on campuses or they've just exited campuses, they're experiencing it based on their HR departments. And I think that this has become kind of a kitchen table issue for a lot of people in a way that was underestimated. Let's be clear
Cancel
about
culture stuff, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, and keep in mind, this is not just, to Emily's previous research, people who feel uncomfortable about expressing their views in public. It's also about expressing their views to their own family members. And I think that that's one of the elements of this that I'll be really interested in future research about, which is the shy Trump voter. We heard about that phenomenon, obviously, going into this election from a lot of different people who thought the president would overperform the poll data that we saw in the public media. I would be very curious to learn more about who that person is. Is it the African-American male, the Hispanic male who likes different aspects of the Trump economic agenda? Is it suburbanite men, in particular, college-educated men who perhaps aren't really being honest with their spouse about who they were voting for? There's a lot of different elements of this that I think we're going to have to dig into in the coming days. But one of the things that I do think is clear is that the president ran this time and has, frankly, pretty consistently approached these issues as someone who was a culture warrior making cause with social conservatives in the country. Even though he is losing a lot of the folks who wanted to perhaps be more socially liberal within the Republican coalition to pull the party in that direction, he's also doing it with an economic moderation message that really, I think, appeals to a lot of not just working class people, but as Henry says, folks who are in a dual earner household holding on to that middle class lifestyle. This is a really interesting and intriguing coalition because it's something that's a challenge to all of the different Republicans. Even if the president doesn't end up winning re-election, clearly this is an agenda and a coalition that Republicans will want to hold on to, and how they appeal to that set of voters could really be the test of the next 3 or 4 years in terms of the agenda that they ramp up to for the next election.
If I could add something
Emily.
really quick to that, to dovetail on what Ben just said, I think that I have a little anecdote to share, and Henry will appreciate this. Henry and I worked together on as part of a consortium of pollsters that routinely field national surveys of very, very large surveys of the electorate. And we were having a meeting with our group, and we were talking about what questions we should be including on the survey to be able to explain the election outcome. And we went through, I reviewed the questionnaire, and everyone that was sitting at the table said, hey, looks, I think we've got all the policy issues that really matter in this election. And I looked at it. Now, there were two things. It didn't have all the policy issues that mattered, but it was more than that, because I realized that for many voters, this isn't just about policy. This is about culture war issues that I think that over the past 4 years that it's really played out, and that Trump in many ways is kind of a symbolic feature of that culture war. He's willing to kind of stand up to, I think many conservative voters feel like their political opponents have a bit of a condescension, patronizing problem towards them, and that Trump is willing to stand up against that. And even though they don't like his style necessarily, and they don't agree with the many rude things that they say, they appreciate that someone is willing to kind of stand up against, stand up in these culture war battles. And so for that reason, I think that a lot of the questions that that kind of matter going forward are not just policy. They're not like, should we raise taxes, lower taxes? What about healthcare? Those things matter. But I think these cultural elements are going to be extremely important. And I think that it offers some opportunities in the future too, because if you can combine, if you can combine the right kinds of policies with how people are really feeling about these other issues that are going on in the culture war, you actually could have a coalition that was really effective. But you have to really understand kind of that this is not just policy, it's also culture.
Lanhee, you've advised a number of presidential candidates. We've worked on campaigns together. You talked to a lot of the people on the Republican side who may run in 2024 if whether or not Trump is reelected, and also presumably some Democrats who are eyeing the 2024 race. What do you see those candidates taking away from the results that we're aware of thus far?
Yeah, I don't know that they're taking away a whole lot right now. I mean, I think they're trying to digest what we've seen and figure out how their message can be sort of calibrated to fit within kind of whatever it is we learn. I mean, certainly the presence of a new, conservative, what are we going to call it, center-right coalition around a set of issues and a set of concerns that, probably didn't impact or weren't considered by a lot of conservative Republican candidates as recently as a decade ago. I mean, I think that's certainly going to be a development. Where I actually wanted to go with the conversation is what I believe is this challenge that Democrats have now, which is that identity politics worked for them until it didn't. And the reality is so timely, because there was just a tweet a little while ago by Ruben Gallego, who represents the 7th district of Arizona. He's Latino, he's a vet, pretty well regarded down there. And the tweet he was responding to with his tweet was, hey, Congressman, what do we do as Democrats to get back the Latinx community? You know what his reply was? First of all, stop using Latinx, because it's not something, but this is what I'm talking about, right? It's this notion that the progressive movement has used identity politics to essentially shoehorn different parts of the population, and they've taken parts of the population for granted without looking at their agenda and realizing it's actually hurting the very people that they're trying to help. If you think about all of the challenges that have been created around the COVID economic lockdowns, the population, one of the populations that's been most adversely affected by that, both in terms of shut schools and shut businesses, have been Latino voters across the country. And those identity politics that the Democrats thought were going to work, clearly in this election, at least in Florida, didn't work for them as they thought it would. Same concept here in California. We had affirmative action, racial preferences on the ballot again, overwhelmingly lost. And you had a bunch of liberal Asian American groups trying to tell Asian Americans, no, affirmative action and racial preferences are actually really good for you. And Asian American voters said, yeah, no, I don't think that's right. Actually, I don't think it's very good for us. So, you have this challenge on the left now where identity politics is running into identity reality. And I think it's very damaging potentially for the progressive movement going forward, and creates a huge opportunity for those of us who believe in the kinds of policy solutions and the kinds of principles that, I think all of us on this call share. So that's what I'm really interested in seeing. What's going to happen over the next couple of years? Can Republican candidates begin to make inroads because of this dynamic, which I think is very real?
Well, we should mention, since we have the stats from the exit poll, for those who haven't seen them, here's how Biden and Trump did with these various ethnic and racial groups. So on white voters, Trump won the white voters 57-42. He won them 58-37 when he was running against Hillary in 2016. With black voters, Biden won 87% this time, 88% the last time. But here's the thing, Trump won 12% of the black vote. He only won 8% of the black vote in 2016. With Latinos, in 2016, Trump won 29%, lost 65%, almost 3-1. It was pretty similar, or now it's a 2-to-1 ratio, I guess you could say. Biden won 66% of Latino voters. Trump won 32%. So he increased his performance with Latinos from 29 to 32. There were some particular congressional races or counties where the discrepancy was far greater than that. Counties that Hillary won by 50-60%, Biden only won by 6%, things like that on the Texas border, for example. Asians, Trump won 31% this time, 21% last time. So it's not like he's winning these demographic groups, but he's clearly making gains. And what's really interesting is the conventional wisdom out there, of course, is that Trump is the most racist president that we've ever had, certainly in modern times. He's certainly been described that way in all the reporting, and that's a widely held view as well. And he's still not exactly winning these groups, but he's increased his share. It's a very, I guess you could say, surprising or contrarian development.
One of the interesting things, if I could jump on Lonnie's point there about this whole situation, is that I really feel like the Biden campaign and the Democratic Party as a whole made a mistake in outsourcing the way that they would reach out to Latino voters to the people who use Latinx, which we know from the Pew research is about 3% of the Latino population. In fact, the majority of folks, I believe in that poll, said that they were unfamiliar with the term, or maybe it was just the plurality. That whole dynamic speaks to the error involved in the identity politics approach of lumping everyone into a category where they expect that category to behave the same way. Avik knows this. I'm half Puerto Rican. My father is Puerto Rican, and Puerto Ricans, my grandfather really did not like Cubans. He didn't get along with Cubans. He had different social values than Cubans. And so to treat him the same way as someone who's a Cuban American would have been to him kind of an insult. It's one of these situations where I think the level of broad-based identity politics has really backfired on the left because they believe certain people should fit certain categories. You see that in the context of tweets that we've seen from New York Times writers like Charles Blow and Nicole Hannah-Jones, from members of Congress like Maxine Waters and the like. And I think that is a real opportunity for people who don't believe that people should be categorized that way, who want to speak instead to economic concerns, to class-based concerns, to concerns about entitlements and healthcare, as opposed to just saying, because you fit this category, this box, well, of course, you must have these political views. I think that's proven to be a significant error in the context of this election, and it's one that I think definitely the right, but everyone should pay attention to.
Data to kind of back up what Ben was saying, which really fast. I have some preliminary data that I wouldn't cite too heavily, but there's some indication that Latinos started to trend a little bit more towards Trump after the lockdowns. This is large surveys that were conducted every week, somewhat suggestive of this. And so I think that kind of bolsters Ben's point that bread and butter issues about like what's going to be best for your family matter more than identity politics a lot of the time. And so that's just something that I think people need to be keeping in mind.
But that's worth also talking about from a Republican perspective, is that basically what Trump accomplished is what the authors of the autopsy in 2012 said should be accomplished by doing exactly the opposite of what they said. What the authors of the autopsy said, we should remove barriers based on false senses of identity for millennials.
Just to stop you, Henry, for people who don't know, the autopsy is the report that the Republican National Committee commissioned after Romney lost in 2012. Please continue.
So what they said was, we need to appeal to Latinos as a group, and they all care about immigration. Well, forget the fact that the data never said that. They weren't interested in the data. They were locked into identity politics. And then, though, the argument was, if we remove these barriers, they will embrace, guess what? GOP establishment economics. It's exactly backwards. It is absolutely essential to reach these people that you do not offer standard GOP economics, which does not mean you go in for socialism, but you cannot be indicated to care more about a rich person's money or a corporation's bottom line or a balance sheet than the lives of individuals and families as they are lived. Donald Trump scores much higher in both of his elections on the question, which quality is most important to you and a president, cares about people like me, than Mitt Romney ever did. And that's precisely because he is unorthodox in economics and speaks to people the way they think of themselves, as ordinary strivers who are trying to get ahead in American life and need some help and then need government to get out of the way. If the Republican Party and the conservative movement thinks that they can wave a culture flag and suddenly inject old line Republican economics, they will have their hat handed to them and they will deserve it.
As a reminder, everyone, if you have questions for us, you can tweet them at hashtag Agenda 2025 or go to the Q&A or chat boxes here on Zoom. We've gotten a bunch of questions in. One thing that a number of people have asked is, what about the urban-rural divide? We've been talking a lot about Democratic identity politics. We should, out of fairness, talk about Republican identity politics. There are a lot of conservatives and Republicans who like to talk about how rural America is the real America, but cities are not part of the real America, even though they're more than half of the American population. There's obviously a religious tone or a sectarian tone sometimes to the way conservatives and Republicans talk that drives away a lot of younger voters who are generally more secular. In particular, let's talk about this urban-rural divide, because this seems to be widening. Trump did do better with minorities, but he lost suburbs. He lost cities and suburbs by a wider margin, as I recall, than he had before. Who wants to take that on?
I'll jump in, which is one, the urban-rural divide is happening around the globe. If you take a look at Canada's election, you saw it happen in the Canadian election, where if you was in a rural area, the Conservative Party's vote share went up. If you were in suburban Toronto, it went down. It's happening in Eastern Europe and explains virtually every single Eastern European party's politics, that if you live in an urban area, you vote for the establishment. If you live in a rural area, you vote for the populace. So it's, the Republicans have a challenge that you cannot adopt that sort of us versus them attitude that makes it worse. But this is a natural outgrowth of the changes that are happening worldwide as people with education and access, who tend to live in cities and suburbs, make laws that benefit themselves and start harming people who are outside of that. And those people tend to live in small metro areas and rural areas. And that's what people are reacting to out there.
Isn't that going to benefit Democrats, though? Isn't the Democratic coalition the one that will benefit from more urbanization, more people living around cities, and these younger voters who are more culturally oriented towards the Democratic cultural politics, one might say?
Look, the Republican Party needs to be competitive in the suburbs, just like the Canadian Conservative Party need to be competitive in the suburbs. But the way you get to be competitive in the suburbs is not by going back to the old days where you were not dominant in the rural areas. What you need to do is build on what you have. And I think the only way to build on what you have is to adopt a view that includes the middle class in suburbs and the educated people in suburbs with the sort of non-ideological approach that works. I think that what you need to do is be less concerned with balancing the budget and more concerned with making sure that people have educational opportunities. I think you need to be more concerned with the things that are driving those votes. The sort of places that moved against Donald Trump in Kansas also moved against Sam Brownback in Kansas when he cared more about tax cuts than he cared about education spending. That's a lesson that every Republican strategist needs to take to heart.
Go ahead.
Just to jump on one point about that, I realize that this is a conversation that is branded Agenda 2025, but we are speaking in the context of the immediate. And I think one of the things that we need to not underestimate as being a political dynamic that the Republican Party and both parties really will have to navigate in the coming couple of years is the level of movement that we've seen in response to different pandemic policies across the country, particularly those in cities. Emily mentioned about the reaction, the early reaction that she's seen among some Hispanic voters to potentially these lockdowns being something that were not particularly popular with them. The level of frustration among parents regarding school lockdowns, particularly those who have been in major cities with strong teachers unions that have the ability to keep these schools closed, is very palpable. And I certainly know many people, including many people in Lanhee's own California, who have actually left the state, moved out of it because they want their children to be able to go back to school, which I know is something that both you, Avik, and Lanhee have argued for in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. This is something that I think is, in the immediate term, going to be a major dynamic in changing the makeup of a lot of these different suburbs. And so I think it's a little too early to maybe assess how significant that's going to be in certain areas. I do think that in your own state of Texas, Avik, this has been a situation where the Republican Party actually did a surprising job of holding on to a lot of seats that many people thought that they were going to lose, including many DC-based Republicans who thought, a seat like Pete Olson's, for instance, was definitely going to be a loss, that the money pouring in to unseat Chip Roy outside of Austin was going to be a loss. That's something that I think maybe changes some of the calculations involved in that. Not all suburbs are going to be the same, and we're going to have to kind of reassess the people who ended up in them.
Lanhee, I mean, you've when we think about the candidates who will think about running in 2024 and that race for president and other offices, what are people thinking about right now in terms of how to adapt to a more urbanized metropolitan environment, a younger or an electorate in which the millennials and Gen Z are a majority of the electorate or close to it? Do you hear people having that conversation, or is it really more about just thinking about the past electorates and the past results and trying to respond to the fighting to the last war?
Yeah, less about the age dynamic. I mean, just if we're being honest, I haven't heard as much about how to expand the appeal from a sort of age range perspective. But there's definitely a lot of conversation, a very active set of conversations about the nature of the economic policy agenda. And what elements of the economic policy agenda that Republicans and conservatives have hewed to for many years needs to be reexamined. What elements of it need to be thrown out entirely. And of course, as you might expect, there are those who aren't comfortable with that, who very much want to hew to a traditional point of view on a number of these different issues. And I don't think one can underestimate or probably state enough just how much of that element still is, not ascendant, but still a big part of the conservative movement. People who want to kind of return to a more traditional kind of market-based view, even though the politics of the last couple of years have showed us that kind of traditionalism probably is not going to fly as part of a big political coalition. You have to be a little bit more deft in how you talk about that. I subscribe completely to Ben's point that not all suburbs are equal, and not all suburban communities are equal, and not all suburban voters are equal. There are some suburban voters who behave more like rural voters. There are others who behave more like urban voters. How do you have an agenda that speaks to all of those people at the same time? I think that's the biggest challenge that I hear a number of these people who may or think about running for president at some point, how they want to deal with it. Now, fortunately, they've got a few years to think through this, but I do think adapting the conservative agenda to the reality of where we are now is going to be one of the central challenges the movement will face over the next several years. And how we do it, people are going to have differences. I'm totally okay with that. I'd love to debate those differences. If it's a substantive policy disagreement, let's have that discussion. But one of the things, and Avik and others, you'll know this from fighting the Obamacare wars, we get into these shooting fights with each other, and sometimes we end up hurting each other a little bit more than helping each other. So I would hope that over the next couple of years, the conversation can be constructive and not destructive.
And can I just add real quickly to Lanhee's point? One of the things that I think we are going to have to assess going forward is how much people try to come up with new ways to replicate the coalition that they saw this time around. Basically, the takeaway from a lot of Republicans who I think are going to run for president in 2024 is this Trump coalition has juice. It definitely is a real thing. It's not a fluke. It's not an accident. It doesn't exist just because Hillary Clinton existed and she was a bad candidate. All these other excuses that were made over the past several years. Instead, I think they're going to be people who try to find new ways to appeal to this same coalition. And they're going to have, to his point, a couple of years to innovate and to come up with different solutions that do that, whether that's on the cultural conversation side of things, maybe the argument that is taking place over big tech and its role in people's lives. Maybe it's going to be on the economic side of things as it relates to trying to actually have a healthcare solution for once that Republicans can unite around. That's going to be very interesting to see. And the people who I think are willing to innovate within that space and to not get too caught up in the ideological structures of the past are going to be folks who are going to have an advantage.
Well, we have a couple of questions about this very topic, which is how much of this coalition or whatever we call it is really Trump dependent and about his unique ability to relate to blue collar workers in a way that your typical Republican politician doesn't do as well as, say, even a Joe Biden. Joe Biden is generally thought of as a pretty relatable guy with blue collar voters. He's from Scranton, Pennsylvania, as he often likes to remind his audiences. There are plenty of Democrats who come from that labor union, blue collar environment. How are other Republicans going to be able to replicate the Trump coalition, or is it more that they're going to try to replicate his manner or maybe some of his policies, but not actually capture the allegiance of those voters? And sort of a parallel question to that is, where do the never Trumpers go? Do they become Democrats? Do the people who really who are deeply offended by the Trump presidency, do they stay Democratic, or do they come back to the fold if someone who doesn't have Trump's personality is the Republican nominee in 2024? Or does something else happen on the Democratic side that attracts those individuals back to stay in the Democratic Party?
So Avik, I feel like there's a lot to unpack there, but I feel like if we could back up just a little bit, I think that there was an interesting, it almost appeared to be a divide, but I actually don't think it is. And I just wanted to kind of highlight and discuss that for a moment when it comes to economic policy. I think that Henry makes really good points. And I think that Henry, you were responding to me earlier with some of your comments about when we talk about economic policy, people need to know that you care about them. And I think that many people would agree that a lot of the actual micro level on the ground economic policy that's happened over the past few years hasn't been bad. At the same time, it's been coupled with rhetoric that emphasizes that, you know, we want to make sure that if you need help, there's someone there to help you. And I think that highlighting kind of a difference between, we don't need to have the government run an entire industry versus you're completely on your own. Those aren't the two options, right? There is an option where we take care of those people who need it. And then we try to let the market do the best that it can to innovate, improve quality, and expand access. And those things, I think, can be combined in a way that are compelling for the working class, compelling for the suburbs. But I think it's all about how you package it. If it comes across, like Henry said earlier, that it's only caring about bottom lines, corporate profits, just, you know, rich people, that's just not going to go well. But I do think that, like, what we've seen over the past 4 years with Trump shows that there's a way to kind of speak to people on economic issues that let them know that you care about them, but at the same time actually do a lot of deregulation and things that can be very, very helpful for a thriving economy. As we saw, the economy was doing very well until the pandemic hit.
You know, Ben, I'm reminded of something you said earlier. You know, you took some perhaps well-deserved pot shots at the think tank media complex, of which we're all technically members. And I think about that in this context related to what Emily just said, which is maybe we're overthinking it in terms of, well, it's this economic policy that led these voters to come to Trump or outperform expectations. He may obviously is more likely to lose the White House than win it. The House will remain Democratic. We should remember, not Republican. Republicans will probably tread water or maybe even lose a seat in the Senate. So it's not like this is some objective triumph for the Republicans. They're still, you know, going to be out of government by and large. They just did better than expectations. But the point I want to make is, again, going back to this Latino and African-American outperformance, maybe it wasn't economic policy. I'm just going to posit this as a hypothesis. What if it was just that he showed up? Trump, more so than any Republican presidential candidate I can remember, campaigned in border counties. He campaigned in Miami-Dade. He campaigned in places like Harlingen, Texas. He has this very catchy YouTube ad in which a bunch of people are like dancing. You know, I can't remember the exact jingle, but it's just a really catchy ad in Spanish that really, I think, you know, captured a lot of his appeal to those striving Latino voters. He did a lot of stuff like that just it seemed to me more about the retail politics of showing up and campaigning versus any specific I did X policy or Y policy.
Well, I think that that's a good question to put to the folks who you know, voted in this way. If only we had a media that was interested in asking them those questions, or a polling unit that had the capability to get the honest answers from them. But yes, I do think that there's a good point to be made about, you know, the president's success, again, in Texas and places like the Rio Grande is not necessarily driven by simply economic questions. They can be driven by a lot of other cultural questions as well. I do think that, the identity politics side of thing and perhaps the cultural priorities of the Democratic ticket this time around maybe has had an outsized effect in pushing a number of Latino voters away. I already saw this being branded as disinformation or misinformation, which I assume is the new, more academic reference to fake news that we saw from a number of reporters saying that that was being pushed out by the Trump campaign via their Spanish language ads. It was entirely, or for the most part, a reference to their talking about socialism and the dangers of it, which is something that I think a lot of Latino voters are very averse to for a lot of different reasons having to do with their family history and the like. Look, I think it's too early to make that kind of assumption. But one thing I do think that we need that that all of the other panelists have talked about in one frame or the other is an understanding of how free market values and those values that have been traditionally part of the coalition of the right in America for so long need a very new approach when it comes to how they are placed in front of the American people. And that means not just talking about corporate success or about big deals and the like, but about talking about small deals, about the things that are going to appeal to your family and appeal to mothers who are worried about the kind of leave that they're going to have after they give birth, that is going to appeal to families that are concerned about their children being trapped in ruinous school experiences. And one of the things that I do think that the president is very cognizant of, along with the way that he campaigns, is that branding side of the approach that he's used, one that I think Republicans would do a lot of good to themselves to learn from. It's just too early, I think, to make that conjecture about which element, which side had more of an appeal when it comes to a lot of these new members of the Republican coalition.
I do think, to Ben's point, though, that painting with sort of bold brushstrokes is something that Trump has done well, whether you agree with it or not. The ability to paint the contrast in a way that is obvious and apparent to anybody who hears it, I think is a very powerful way of communicating with voters of all stripes. People in the elite media in particular make fun of the socialism, free enterprise contrast. But that is a very real contrast for many Americans who come from backgrounds where socialism is a real thing, where they still interact with elements of socialist economies. And it is quite clear that the modern progressive movement, at least on its fringes, or not even maybe its fringes, but the throwaway to the power in the modern progressive movement is to move the economy in a more socialist direction. I think stating that clearly and being willing to stand by it is a really important thing. And it's a really important thing to be willing to say, that's one view of the world. Here's our very different view of the world. And to not be cowed by those who say, well, the public option isn't really socialism. The Green New Deal is not really socialism. Well, no, actually, there are elements of it that are socialist. And so drawing that contrast in a bright line way, which I think the president probably does better than anybody, that is something I think, back to the 2024 conversation, whoever the nominee of the party is next, I think will need to be able to draw in broad and bright brushstrokes and not deal in subtleties. And having worked for many candidates who deal in subtleties, it's a challenge. I mean, I tend to deal in subtleties. So it's a challenge for me personally, but I think it's something that our movement and our party needs to be better about.
Let me go around the horn here, starting with you, Henry. And I'm going to ask each of you this question, or just go at one after the other. What's the thing that the Republicans did most wrong in the last 4 years, and what's the thing the Democrats did the most right?
Republicans, have been so subsumed under Trump that it's really a question of what did Trump do wrong as opposed to what did the Republicans do wrong. I would say, with respect to the Republicans, it's that we are still behind the curve in accepting the permanence and the advantageousness of the Trump coalition. That's something Lanhee and others alluded to, that there's still a lot of resistance to that idea. Hopefully that will go away, but we are behind the curve because of that resistance. Trump's biggest problem, I think, was not in he should be doing the sort of broad brush confrontational messaging that he's doing. The problem was he engaged in it too frequently and too erratically, that there's no reason for him to be tweeting about Mika's facelift or which country Ilhan Omar is or is not a citizen of. There's too much ammunition that he gave his enemies that built up in sense among educated suburbanites that he's not one of us. And if you can get over that, you've got a 53-55% coalition of people who can come together in a conservative populist alliance that sees socialism as an enemy and free enterprise modulated by an active, limited but energetic government providing help but not handouts. That's a natural majority in this country and will be for quite some time, that the president prevented from coming together because part of the excess in building his coalition prevented him from making it a majority coalition.
What about on the Democratic side, Henry?
On the Democratic side, I think the thing—
what did they do right?
Yeah, I think the first thing they did right was nominate Joe Biden. That they didn't have a whole lot of strong candidates, and given that Amy Klobuchar was not aggressive enough at making the case for herself in the primaries, the biggest thing they did right was putting up somebody who was non-offensive and was difficult to say, believed in his heart in socialism and wokeness. That gave them a fighting chance. I think most of the other people would have been caricatured in that way. Certainly Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and I think somebody like a Kamala Harris, or Cory Booker, who's kind of transmogrified into a reasonable center-left Democrat, into a caricature of a woke warrior. I think the smartest thing they did right was nominating Joe Biden, because that gave him a fighting chance that allowed a personality to overcome the divisive elements of their coalition's message.
Emily?
Okay, sorry, I was muting. So I agree with what Henry said, and I would add a couple of things. I think that, so there's the question about which Republicans, Republican leadership or Republican voters. I think that there was a lot of apologizing for and kind of making excuses for the incivility aspects of Trump's behavior, or not a full acknowledgement. Now, I understand why, because lawmakers and Republican leaders that did try to call it out, like Jeff Flake, things didn't go well for them. And candidates who were more critical of Trump, even in the midterms, suffered or lost seats. And so I understand this, but I do think that this is going to have an impact on young people, Gen Z and millennials. Research shows that the political environment that exists when people come of political age, political adulthood, that's between the ages of, say, like 18 to 24, can have a lasting impact on how you think about politics. So young people in the 1930s that kind of came of political adulthood when Roosevelt was president permanently remained a little bit more democratic. That doesn't mean some of them didn't vote for Republicans later on, but there was always that edge. Similarly for Reagan. Reagan had a lasting effect that made many of Gen Z, Gen X, no, yeah, I'm getting these generations mixed up, more Republican. And I think that right now, Trump has had a lasting effect on young people that's going to give Democrats kind of a permanent, ongoing, slight advantage, even as those young people get older, buy houses, pay more in taxes, have families. They're going to be a little bit more likely to see the Republican Party as a party that has animosity towards immigrants and kind of cosmopolitan pluralism. And so that's something that I think will last into the future. As for, what Democrats have done right, I think if you had asked me that a year ago, I'd have a better answer. I feel like over this summer and the behavior that we saw over the summer and the apologizing for the behavior over the summer has changed things. But I do agree that nominating Biden was a very pragmatic choice. I know it was a choice that many didn't like and they weren't excited about and didn't energize their base. But I think it was ultimately like the smart decision for what they needed to do.
Ben?
I'm going to give a trollish answer and then a real answer. The actual answer to what Republicans should have done differently is fire James Comey the first day that Donald Trump took office, because I think that his first year or two might have gone in a very different direction if that had been the case. The actual answer that I will give you is, I think that Republicans underestimated the Trump phenomenon as being a fluke, and have kind of danced back and forth between accepting it as something that was very real, represented the future of their coalition, and something that could just be temporary. There are a number of prominent people who have done this. I mean, I would include, frankly, Ben Sass's comments that came out in the Washington Examiner before the election, Liz Cheney's comments that have been occasionally quoted, trying to distance themselves from the president or from his agenda. I think that those were really mistaken. And I think the flip side of that is you saw how much it benefited, I think, someone like Lindsey Graham this time around, who had seen a lot of his support erode, who could have been vulnerable to a conservative primary challenge, really, assemble a coalition in South Carolina that allowed him to beat an extremely well-funded candidate, and maybe, the first time that he had been significantly threatened in a situation like that because of his loyalty to what the conservative base of his party wanted. On the Democratic side, I think that you have to give credit to the Democratic leadership that resisted so much the dominant kind of online narrative about what the Democratic Party ought to be about. And the Biden nomination is included within this. But, frankly, Nancy Pelosi didn't want to do impeachment. She wanted to hold back on that because she knew that it wouldn't be a political winner. Clearly, in the closing days of this election, it was not something that Democrats were talking about. And Trump himself was the one who was bringing it up in debates and the like. Yet they really did hold down and tamp down on a significant portion of their younger, woke, very online base that wants them to be far more extreme on all of these identity politics issues, wants them to do things that are really crazy. They want the Green New Deal not just as an aspect of policy, a Freedom Caucus-like proposal from social justice Democrats. They want it to be at the center of the party's aim. And while Biden certainly has given lip service to that kind of leftist policy, I think that as a whole, the Democratic establishment really did put the foot down to a great degree on all of these different socialists. Now, the problem for them is without the US Senate, this now creates a situation where even under a Biden presidency, they're not going to be able to deal in kind of a trading back and forth manner with this leftist equivalent of the Freedom Caucus that's going to be part of the House majority right now for Nancy Pelosi. People who really wanted to pack the court, defund the police from a federal level as much as they could, add 2 states, get rid of the filibuster. They wanted a lot of things that were quite extreme. Instead of giving them 1 or 2 of those things in exchange for them, supporting a more moderate tax agenda or different things that Democratic leaders want, they're going to be a little bit more hamstrung and restrained in terms of their ability to advance that kind of agenda. That's going to prove to be a huge problem, I think, under a Biden administration. It's one of the reasons there's a headline at Politico this morning that says Biden is screwed even if he wins. Basically, there's a lot of expectations built in from the left. Hey, we wanted Bernie, we didn't get Bernie, but we came along for the ride. Now it's going to be, I think, a lot more difficult to give them the things that they want, other things under an approach other than, say, executive orders and the like.
So, yeah, so my 2 are related. What the Democrats have done well, I think, is to embrace, to a certain degree, the emerging status quo on China. They were very slow to this. The traditional sort of foreign policy establishment view on the left was that China was a country to be coddled, in essence, that we had to deal with them with kid gloves because at some point they'd come around and become responsible members of the international community. And we know now that they're not going to come around, that they're going to continue to behave in predatory ways, whether it's with respect to economics or military action. And I think Democrats actually, by and large, kind of agree with that now. Now, I would argue the base of the Democratic Party has kind of always been there. Their elite politicians haven't been there. And particularly if you look at the disastrous Obama-Biden foreign policy with respect to China, certainly Biden wasn't there. But I think he's a little bit more there now because his party and the thinking in his party has evolved. And I would say the embrace of that has been one thing that Democrats probably have done well and does, I think it's a harbinger of good things potentially if Biden ends up winning this thing, hopefully his administration continues a tougher line on China. What the Republicans didn't do well enough is to prosecute that case against China more aggressively. And I think there are some within the Republican Party who did. The president certainly did at times, although at other times he was sort of a little warm and fuzzy towards Xi Jinping, which is strange, but ultimately not productive to coddle a dictator. And so there was that element of it, but there was also this element of elements of the Republican coalition, primarily, I think, the corporatist part of the Republican coalition, who didn't want to run afoul of China for business reasons. And look, you can't play footsie with the Chinese Communist Party. And the Republican Party and the Republican establishment, not being, particularly the national security establishment, not being willing to take on that harder edge. And thankfully, the president and Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley and Mitt Romney and others in the Senate have been quite aggressive on China. Thankfully, there have been some who have been willing to do it. But the establishment is still very leery. You talk to a number of Republicans who are part of that national security establishment. They're still, well, we got to be careful with China. That view, I think, wasn't what was too prominent. We needed to be a little bit more aggressive from day one, and I think follow Trump's lead in this respect when he was talking about it on the campaign trail. So that's one thing I wish Republicans had accomplished more on during the last 4 years.
All right. One sentence answers. We're getting close to the end here from each of you. What do you think would be one issue that you would highlight as an opportunity for a Biden administration and a Republican Senate to work together on? Henry, go ahead.
Constitutional reform, that I think we're seeing the confirmation battles of the judges demonstrate that the powers we give to courts today are too much and inconsistent with democratic government. And I think if you could work together to create a new vision for a activist but limited court system, that would be something that you could work together fruitfully on.
Emily.
I'm a pollster. I don't think about some of these more kind of micro.
Right. Ben, go ahead.
Washington is better at nothing other than spending money. Obviously, we're finally going to get infrastructure week. There's no question in my mind about it. Biden comes to them, they want to spend a bunch of money. The debate becomes how much money we spend. I think that's what's going to be in the same package.
Since Ben stole my answer, I have to come up with another one, and I'm going to say a topic near and dear to Avik's heart, which is prescription drug pricing reform. Mm-hmm. This is an area where I think there is an emerging consensus amongst some Republicans and a number of Democrats that we've got a very, very broken system. And there's a reason why people are frustrated about the high prices they pay or perceive to pay on prescription drugs. And I think that's an area that's ripe for reform in a Biden administration with a Republican Senate.
I'll add one thing
go ahead, please.
You
Emily.
can say, if you care about the levels of government spending, the lowest rate of growth of government spending occurs when you've got a Democratic president and Republicans in the Congress.
So some room for hope on that. Well, listen, we're out of time here. Before we go, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. A really interesting group. I learned from all of you. I want to mention that tomorrow's panel at the same time, 3:30 Eastern time, will feature me, David Frum of The Atlantic, Rich Lauer, the editor of National Review, Steve Tellis from the Niskanen Center, and Yasha Munk of the New America Foundation and Persuasion, talking about what are the prospects for a new liberal movement that combines some of the ideas that we've talked about today: economic mobility, free enterprise, pluralism, combining, say, the best of what the Democrats and Republicans are doing, or the most appealing elements of their agenda. So stay tuned for that tomorrow. If you want to see the rest of the agenda for the Agenda 2025 conference, go to agenda.freopp.org. With that, let me sign off and thank all of you for your questions, and thank all of you, Emily, Henry, Ben, and Lanhee, for spending some of your day with us today on a very busy day. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.